saying it was a legal requirement that youngsters should join the Hitler Youth in its various components.
They stood in ruins with fire behind them and orders in their hands. Not old enough to vote, but told they were old enough to die. Their faces were still soft. Their minds are still forming. But the uniforms were real, the rifles were heavy, and the lies they were told even heavier.
But there can be no doubt whatsoever that the largest and by far the most successful of these organizations was the Hitler Youth.
These were Hitler's last defenders, not warriors, but boys, raised in classrooms filled with silence and flags, trained to obey without asking why.
Who were the young Hitler Youths, and what had they done to merit such attention?
Their loyalty was not earned. It was carved into them, quietly, brutally, until they forgot who they were. Let's dive into the making of the Hitler Youth. Seeds of obedience. It didn't start with war cries or uniforms or even rules. It started with stories, simple ones. Stories about pride, about strength, about belonging. They were told in classrooms, whispered in playgrounds, passed between brothers and friends. Stories that slowly rewrote what it meant to be German, and more importantly, what it meant not to be. In 1922, the seeds were planted. The first version of the Hitler Youth was nothing more than a handful of boys wrapped in homemade banners, mimicking their fathers and dreaming of battles they didn't understand. Just over 1,000 joined that year. Not many, not yet, but they believed they were part of something special. And for a child, being chosen is everything. By 1932, there were over 100,000, not because of threats or laws, but because of the feeling of purpose, of being needed, of finally standing tall in a world that never looked down to meet their eyes before. The songs they sang were loud, but the real work happened in silence, in the way textbooks were edited, in the way history was tilted, in the way teachers paused when certain names were mentioned. Slowly, obedience became a virtue. Questioning became a flaw. They were told they were the pure ones, the strong ones, the hope of a wounded nation, and they wanted to believe it. Fathers nodded in approval. Mothers stitched uniforms with shaking hands. Some saw what was happening. Most didn't. It wasn't just a youth group. It was a transformation, quiet, methodical, relentless. A generation was being bent, not with violence, but with vision. And the boys who once chased kites and carved names into trees began to chase something else. They didn't see where it led, not yet. All they knew was that the path was lit and the world was watching. And so they walked forward, singing. The 1936 law and mandatory indoctrination. They had marched willingly at first, flags in hand, songs in their throats. They believed it made them strong. They believed it made them seen. But in 1936, the marching became mandatory. On December 1st, the Nazi regime passed a law that would reshape the childhood of an entire nation. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't hidden. It declared that the future of Germany belonged to its youth, and so the youth would belong to the Führer. Every German child between 10 and 18 was required to join. It didn't matter who you were, what your family believed, or what your church taught. The state now stood between every child and the rest of their life. It was called preparation, moral, physical, and ideological education. But it wasn't education, it was engineering. Other youth groups were dissolved overnight. Catholic organizations held on for a while, but the pressure was relentless. One by one, resistance faded. Teachers were ordered to monitor participation. Parents who protested were labeled disloyal. Neighbors noticed. Everyone noticed. Inside the schools, the line between teacher and officer blurred. Math problems included bullets and tanks. Science lessons ranked races. Literature disappeared under slogans. And every morning began the same way, not with prayer or poetry, but with a salute in a name. Adolf Hitler. At home, uniforms replaced play clothes. Heil Hitler replaced good morning. Children were rewarded for reporting on their parents. A boy could earn praise for betraying his father. A girl could earn status for turning into a priest. And in this new world, silence became the safest answer. Questions grew dangerous. Doubts stayed buried. What had once been a choice became a cage. A golden one, maybe, covered in symbols and songs, but still a cage. And those who tried to escape it quickly learned how cold the world outside had become. Life inside the Hitler Youth. Inside the Hitler Youth, life wasn't just structured, it was scripted. Mornings began with drills, marching in rows, standing in the cold until your spine ached, shouting chants until your throat burns. Uniforms were checked, hair inspected, mistakes punished, You were either proud or you were corrected. The boys were trained like soldiers, not tomorrow, not someday. Now they learned how to crawl through trenches, how to disassemble rifles, how to carry weight beyond their size. But the heaviest weight wasn't in their packs, it was in their minds. That they were not boys anymore. That they were protectors of a race, guardians of a dream. For girls, the path was different, but the message was the same. Their duty was to be pure, to serve the Reich through motherhood, through care, through obedience. They were told their value was in what they could offer to the state, not in thought, not in voice and silence. The free hours of childhood were gone, replaced with marching songs, flag rituals, and endurance contests. Their weekends were taken by camps, filled with smoke and shouting and carefully measured smiles. Even laughter had rules. And yet, some of them loved it. Not because they were cruel, but because they had never known anything else. For many, it was the first time they felt seen, the first time they felt important, the first time someone said, "You matter." The salutes became automatic. The loyalty oaths, like prayers, they weren't just part of a youth group, they were the youth of Germany, the pride of the nation. And questioning that pride felt like betrayal. So they didn't question. They stood taller, shouted louder, obeyed faster, and slowly the line between who they were and who they were becoming disappeared until nothing was left but the uniform.
Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you.
War and leadership vacuum. When the war began, everything changed, but the children stayed in uniform. At first, they were still seen as too young, too precious. Their job was to march, to sing, to believe. But the front lines were hungry, the Wehrmacht was bleeding, and slowly the age of a soldier began to shrink. By late 1939, the oldest Hitler youth, the 17 and 18-year-olds, were called up. Boys who had once led songs around campfires were now being sent east to face the Soviet winter. Many never came back. Those who did returned with eyes that didn't blink and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Leadership positions in the youth became empty, so they filled them with 15-year-olds, sometimes 14. In some units, 13-year-olds gave orders to 12-year-olds.
Within 2 weeks, the age limit was lowered to 14, and at the very end of the war, in my own unit, I had boys of 12.
They had memorized the chants. They knew the drills, but none of them were ready. They wore the same uniforms. They shouted the same slogans, but something was missing. Not discipline, understanding, not strength, guidance. Some of them tried to pretend. They mimicked the toughness of their former leaders, but their fears slipped through the cracks. They were just boys standing in shoes that didn't fit, trying to be something they didn't yet understand. Mistakes happened, accidents, punishments, and still they kept going. Because to stop was unthinkable. There was no one left to pass the torch to, no adults to step in, no pause in the orders. They had been told to lead, so they did. And every week the numbers dropped again. The spaces in the ranks grew wider, the laughter rarer, the questions fewer. The war had made them leaders, but not men. And as the cities crumbled and the battles closed in, they kept marching forward, not because they believed they would win, but because they didn't know what to do without the march. Berlin's final youth army. By April 1945, Berlin was bleeding. The city echoed with fire and falling stone. Sirens screamed through empty streets. But inside bunkers and cellars, boys waited. Not because they chose to, but because there was no one else left. Hans Petersen was one of them. He was 16. His jacket still smelled like the starch his mother once used. On the sleeve, a freshly sewn patch marked him as part of the Feldherrnhalle detachment, a unit made almost entirely of children. His orders were clear: hold the canal, stop the tanks, don't run. They didn't run. 90 boys went into that mission, 3 survived. Hans watched his friends die in seconds, not in glory but in confusion. The Russians came fast. The 4th tank didn't stop. There was no music, no salute, just metal and fire, and screams. He hid in a basement, blood on his hands, none of it his. Above him, the walls cracked with artillery. Somewhere nearby, a woman was screaming. He wanted to cover his ears. He wanted to sleep. But his rifle lay in his lap like a secret he couldn't return. They had promised him a medal. Instead, they gave him silence. He once dreamed of fighting for Germany. He had memorized maps, learned the names of generals. He thought war would make him a man. But in that basement, with a city dying above him, he understood something deeper. War didn't make you a man, it made you disappear. Fanaticism and death. Even as the Reich collapsed, the orders kept coming. There were still Jews to kill, still traitors to silence, still enemies hiding in the smoke. The Hitler Youth obeyed not because they were heartless, but because they had been trained not to feel. In towns far from the front, boys stood beside SS officers and pulled triggers. Some of the condemned were barely older than they were. Some weren't guilty of anything. A stolen piece of bread.
The Nazi invasion. We now know the BBC was using music at the end of the news to send secret messages to the resistance.
A radio tuned to the BBC. It didn't matter. Loyalty demanded blood now. Execution wasn't reserved for soldiers anymore. It belonged to anyone willing to follow orders. And the youngest hands were often the steadiest, not from calm, but from fear. Some wept afterward, some didn't. They were told it was right, that killing was service, that mercy was weakness. And when the moment came, many of them believed it. Not all, but enough. The camps were emptying, the ditches were filling. The forests around villages grew quiet with buried secrets. Even as Soviet tanks closed in on Berlin, even as the sky turned red with ruin, the machinery of death kept moving, and so did the children inside it. Hans had seen it too. He had watched a boy younger than him shoot a prisoner who tried to crawl away. They had promised these boys a future, but first they had to unlearn being human. Berlin becomes a mausoleum. By the end, Berlin was no longer a city, it was a tomb. The streets were filled with dust and footsteps that had nowhere to go. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Smoke poured from buildings with no names anymore. And scattered in every ruined corner were the last defenders of the Reich, most of them children. Not just Germans, nor just boys. Scandinavians, French, Italians, Spaniards. Foreign volunteers who believed in the myth more than the map. They had been told this was a fight for Western civilization. If Berlin fell, the world would follow. That behind the Soviet lines, darkness waited. They held on to that idea like a prayer. Hans believed it too. He had no love for the Russians, only fear. He had seen the women dragged into buildings, heard the cries no boy should ever hear. He thought, this is what happens if we lose. But he also began to think about something else, something that made his stomach twist. What if we already have? The Reich's commanders had disappeared into bunkers. The older soldiers were dead or broken. Orders came late, if they came at all. And still, the children fought. Not because they saw victory, but because they couldn't imagine anything else. Berlin had become a mausoleum. Not just for a nation, but for a generation. And its youngest mourners didn't even know they were grieving. Personal testimonies. Years later, the silence broke. Some of the boys who had served grew up with ghosts they couldn't name. Others tried to forget. A few spoke. One of them was Hermann Grammel. Born in 1928, he had once been proud to wear the uniform. He remembered the hymns, the chants, the way the adults praised them. He remembered standing tall during oaths of loyalty to Hitler, feeling seen, maybe for the first time in his life. What the church never gave him, what his school never noticed, the Hitler Youth did. Attention, autonomy, power. He said it felt good. That was the hardest part. But he also remembered the discomfort, the racism dressed up as science, the coldness in lessons about who deserved to live and who didn't. At the time, it felt distant, abstract, until it wasn't. Grammel admitted he and his friends accepted their place in the war without hesitation. They had been preparing for it for years. There was no fear, just excitement, risk, adventure. Only later did he understand what had been taken from him. The right to wonder, to question, to grow slowly. They were not shaped into adults. They were hardened into tools. And when the war ended, those tools were left rusting in the ruins, forced to remember not what they'd done, but what they were never allowed to be. They were not born to serve, not born to hate. They were born like all children, open, searching, full of questions. But the answers came too early, too loud, and too final. The Hitler Youth did not just steal their time, it stole their becoming. Some survived the war, but none truly returned from it. They were told they were the future, and so the past was erased. This isn't just a warning from history, it's a mirror. Because the most dangerous thing a child can carry is someone else's certainty, and the most powerful rebellion is learning how to doubt.